My name is Glodine Brown. I'm the General Manager at CAFKA. Thank you for joining us for this evening's talk with Shary Boyle. This year, CAFKA is celebrating its 20th anniversary. The CAFKA.21 Biennial, Everything Not Saved Will Be Lost, is taking place as a series of activations throughout the summer, bringing thought-provoking contemporary art to primarily outdoor spaces in Waterloo Region. The theme of this year's biennial invites us to reflect on our everyday practices, our values, and our hopes. It also asks us to think about the things that could and perhaps should be left behind. Tonight's talk is being presented in partnership with Cambridge Galleries and Idea Exchange. CAFKA would like to acknowledge that we live and work on the traditional territory of the Attawandaron, Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. The region of Waterloo is situated on Block 2 of the Haldimand Tract, land promised to 6 nations, which includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, also known as the 6 Nations of the Grand River, were granted this land to enjoy forever as part of the 1784 Haldimand Treaty with the British, after the 6 nations were dispossessed of their land in upstate New York following the American Revolution. The Haldimand Tract was reduced to less than 5% of this original territory in the over 200 years since, primarily through the loss of land to encroaching settlers. The Haudenosaunee Great Law emphasizes collective responsibilities and rights, and with this, the principle of dish with one spoon, a treaty extended with the Anishinaabe and the British, which stipulated that the land was to be shared equally, collectively, and with the utmost attention paid to peaceful relations and the conservation of lands for future generations. As an organization composed of individual artists, arts workers, and community members with diverse backgrounds and histories, it is always our responsibility to learn, acknowledge, respect, and uphold the treaties made with Indigenous nations, and respect the right to land and life on unceded territories whose traditional caretakers continue to resist colonial violence today. Now, before I introduce Shary, I just quickly want to go over our community guidelines. There will be a Q&A after Shary's talk. We do hold a zero tolerance policy for the use of slurs, offensive language, racism, or any form of marginalization or discrimination. Any violation of these terms will result in the participant being removed from the session. We want to make sure that this virtual space is welcoming to all. So feel free to use the chat and to make comments. Okay, so Shary Boyle works across diverse media, including sculpture, drawing, installation, and performance. Highly crafted and deeply imaginative, her practice is activated through collaboration, volunteerism, and apprenticeship. Boyle's work considers the social history of ceramic figurines, animist mythologies, antiquated technologies, and folk art forms to create a symbolic, feminist, and politically charged language uniquely her own. Shary Boyle's work is exhibited and collected internationally. She represented Canada with her project Music for Silence at the 55th Venice Biennale in 2013, and has been commissioned to create a new project for the 2021 Kaunas Biennial in Lithuania. Boyle is the recipient of Canada's Hunashton Foundation Award and the Gershon Itzkowitz Prize. In 2021, the Ontario College of Art and Design University awarded her with an honorary doctorate of fine arts. Outside the Palace of Me, a solo touring exhibition of Shary Boyle's work will be presented at the Gardner Museum in Toronto and the Museum of Fine Arts Montreal in 2022, and the Vancouver Art Gallery in 2023. White Elephant will be part of this exhibition. Art Canada Institute will publish an accompanying monograph in fall of 2021. Now I'll turn it over to Shary to talk about the making of White Elephant. Shary.
Thank you, Glodine. Thanks so much. I'd like to thank everybody at CAFKA, Glodine, and the board of directors and all the installation crew, the people that have been helping with the incredible programming and facilitating the participants of the White Elephant reading group and discussion group. All the people at Cambridge Library Idea Exchange Gallery for hosting White Elephant for 2 weeks. I really appreciate everybody's labor and the support too of financial support of arts grants and individuals that have stepped forward to help this happen. It's been a really long go, and with COVID and kind of delays, it's given us all a lot of time to think about it and plan the best we can. So I'm going to talk tonight about my project and what went into it, the ideas behind it. But I'd like to kind of preface this by the obvious statement that this is a difficult subject that's complicated and controversial and sensitive, and it can be emotional, and every single person that engages with it, whether you're white yourself or of color, Black, Indigenous, has a different perspective and a valid and unique point of view that comes from all the intersections of the lives and the experiences they've led. And tonight I'd like to let everybody know that this project and a lot of the thinking behind it, I'm in conversation with other white people, because it's very clear to people that are thinking about these subjects that people of color, Black and Indigenous people, know this territory so deeply and so well, and have been thinking and unpacking and kind of activating and resisting it for so long that there's really nothing that I can say to them. But what I can say is talking about my own experience as a white Canadian, and hopefully to other white people as well. Everybody, welcome, and I enjoy your questions at the end. When CAFKA first approached me in 2017 to do a project with the public, kind of idea of making something for open public spaces, I was too busy at that year, but they came back to me, Gordon Hatt at the time, and through conversation with him, I realized that I really would like to make something. And my first idea in terms of speaking outside the art kind of gallery or the museum is to do something around justice. My first ideas were around actually working somehow with Themis, the ancient Greek titan of justice. But with all the reading that I've been doing for years on the subjects of around race and around the history of Canada and kind of basic inequity, and learning more about the people and that have been living here on this land for millennia, and the people that have come in and experienced such kind of brutal realities as the white kind of colonial experience is so deep and so kind of baked in. It felt to me that what was really important was actually to address and speak about whiteness as a white artist. And because I wasn't seeing a lot of that in looking around in Canada, asking myself if any other white artists were addressing this subject in their work, that is so incredibly crucial, but also because so many of the people that I had been reading and listening to in so many formats were asking directly white people to stop asking or expecting BIPOC people to do that labor, to do that unpaid, exhausting, upsetting, awkward, and shitty labor. And I thought about how I could possibly take on such a difficult and complicated and contradictory subject when the real issue that other people will speak of as well is that by being an artist, a white artist speaking about whiteness, I am automatically centering myself. And this, as we can see and we know, is an ancient kind of rooted experience of whiteness. And to the point where I think that many white people who have been the majority in Canada, and I can only speak of the Canadian context, have kind of almost forgotten and take for granted that so much has been made in our own image to serve our own needs. But when you see an illustration like this, it really hits home in a very painful but stark way. And I think it's important to look at those things to remember what we're dealing with and what's unconscious and kind of has paved the way for so much of the thinking that we deal with now. And how white people have attempted to make the world in their own image. And this is a classic image that everybody will be familiar with. And, the troubling strangeness of this white man who has conquered so much of the Western world. Knowing that, I think it's incredibly important, yet very difficult, I chose to make this project because I noticed, especially at the time, 2018, white people just weren't speaking about this in general because of how painful and awkward and guilty and bad. And also people are so afraid to do it wrong, say it wrong, get called out. Social media has become a climate of extreme, fear and can be quite punitive, and people are feeling very exposed, but also because there's such a sense of not knowing actually like how to change such a deep rooted system that we're all participating in. But at the same time, as we know, white silence is violence. So as we see the culture of militarization and kind of the patriarchy and colonialism and white supremacy knitted together, we see how important it is for white people to stand up and address this together, to become more comfortable to speak about the subject of our whiteness and our identity as white people, how that's impacted people, anybody else other than white people, and step back and start asking ourselves really serious questions about it. And I think that it's helped me also as a person that's identified as a woman to think about how important it is for men in the patriarchy to address other men about subjects of violence and sexualization, sexual violence, and kind of male supremacy. So in that way, I think it's a very important place that white people have in order to speak to each other and to bear some of this burden. So here we go. How can we talk about whiteness and what is whiteness? And that, again, is another reason why I think many people don't speak about it, because we really haven't defined it, especially in Canada, because many white people here, if they're coming from a perspective that I can only speak of my own, which is maybe third generation settler, colonial settler, we've left our traditions back in wherever we originally came. And unless your parents, grandparents have carried them through, then we can really not be connected to our countries or cultures of origin. So all the folk kind of traditions and the traditions that we had are no longer taking place here, except the ones that might be baked in through kind of French or English kind of colonial behaviors and mannerisms. But even that is a bit foggy and lost. So in a way, the question of all of us, where are we, who are we? And once we come to Canada, that is none of our lands, it's Indigenous land, who are we now? I had to just surf around and try to find some images of the innocuousness of whiteness, which, when you're somebody that's in the art world in particular, so many of us, we're educated often, people that have been very thoughtful. We're kind of, in some ways, talks like this can be preaching to the converted. What I've been very interested in as a person from a family that didn't have a lot of a kind of university education or political kind of sensitivity or thoughts around this stuff, is how can we speak to the general public, that people that are not plugged in and that aren't really connected, don't want to think about it, don't want to talk about it, it's very awkward, and they just want to live their lives like everybody does. How can we reach them, especially in the arts, and especially when so many people that are white often, even we haven't intentionally lifted a finger against anybody and really don't want to hurt anybody. And some of us in particular have gone to great lengths to be as active as possible in the anti-racist movement, yet we have this overall kind of fantasy of whiteness as ridiculous and harmless and innocent. So these are kind of these images. I was like, what's the whitest images that I can find out there? And that's a few that I came up with. So I'm also trying to it's really important to have some humility and laugh at yourself. But in this context, and Kafka and myself as an artist, I am not a white, a scholar of whiteness or an academic or any of the kind of amazing people that have been called up to speak on race through the programming of Kafka for this project. I don't have those credentials. So I'm an artist and I speak through art. I speak through images. I spend a lot of time alone, thinking, reflecting, worrying, trying to imagine how I can communicate through the medium of my life, which is visual art. And so something that came up to me in an image here that represents that is this unbelievable movie called The Square by Ruben Östlund in 2017. A lot of interesting movies were made in 2017. This one was very memorable for the scene of a kind of Swedish patron group of a very important museum, of course, all white, with a performance artist creating an extremely hostile and aggressive performance on the tables before dinner, supposedly for the entertainment of the patrons, but really to kind of act out a kind of primate chimp version of hostile power aggression, which was this incredible manifestation in a visual way, in a narrative storytelling way, of a kind of violence and terror that's at the heart of these kind of power structures, and how many people are actually quite hurt by them. I also think in the arts, you know, many people have kind of heard the conversation ongoing about the archival processes of archaeological kind of and conservator culture around white Greek statuary and the kind of pristine white marble, white plaster works that have been preserved in museums all over Europe and North America. In particular, I was very interested in that Goethe quote from his Theory of Colors, that where he declared the savage nations, uneducated people, and children have great predilection for vivid colors. He also noted that people of refinement avoid vivid colors in their dress and the objects that are around them. And that has influenced the art world and the kind of upper economic realm of class systems for centuries. And this idea that these sculptures were white is false. They were not white, they were painted. The paint and the pigments have worn off over the centuries of time. And so people have mistakenly confused and kind of put their own ideas on top of these sculptures that white equals pure and refinement, which, you know, I didn't do my MFA. I didn't go through these systems of learning all the same theory as all the other MFA grads, art grads. I really, you know, graduated at 21 from OCAD and never went back to school. So all my learning is kind of self-learning of what I've been interested in, but I can tell you right now that even they're still getting it wrong. I mean, all the repainting and the recreations, the reconstructions of these sculptures that they're showing in exhibits around the world, they're still making them white. So they've painted them, but they're still pink skinned. So it's an interesting conversation. Like things are going forward and they're going backward and they're contradicting each other and they're so complicated. I've been thinking about power, class, accountability, and trying to think about responsibility for most of my life, kind of coming out of a bit of like a punk ethos in high school and carrying that through in my art making practice. In 2003, I made this drawing in a book called The Story of Jane Doe, where I illustrated a really important story. I can't get into it, but please look it up, The Story of Jane Doe by Random House. And in this particular image, I'm thinking about police accountability. And I am blown away. Here we are, you know, days after the Lamport Stadium, chaos of police violence, brutalizing completely unarmed people, houseless people in tents, young people, old people trying to just protect their right to live in a park, completely oh, it's so frustrating and upsetting, but like completely not scary. And why are the police so scared? And why aren't they accountable? This is all, you know, obviously, again, colonialism, white supremacy, patriarchy, violence. And we as white people, what have we made here and what are we letting happen, and how can we change these systems that seem so deep? I made this work, White Fright, in 2006. I think I was thinking about white fragility. This is lace-striped porcelain. You would just touch it and it would break apart. It was incredibly difficult to make in the kiln, so there's great care and detail and care, like painstaking kind of handcraft in the making of it, but it's also an animal that provokes kind of terror in its own, and the idea of transmission. Bats are something that have come up in my work for a long time. And this particular one, I was thinking about how afraid white people are and how that fear can translate into defensive violence. In 2007, I spent time in England at a residency, and while I was there, it was the bicentennial of the abolishment of slavery. There were many exhibitions around London, England, around the idea kind of celebrating their move to abolish slavery all those 150 years ago. Very interesting that the conversation was so recent, and that that all the treasures in those museums were pillaged and remain so. So we have been major issues in museums around kind of white colonial powers that have stolen many sacred and important cultural objects from everywhere in the world, and that great wealth is being held, and kind of the basis, like all resource extraction, the basis of much white wealth. So while I was there, I was just trying to wrap my head around a big far step back about, well, this is called the clearances, about just the notion of the kind of doctrine of discovery, the kind of idea that people with power that are greedy, that want wealth, go to another place. The papal kind of doctrine have enabled this hundreds of years ago, and is the basis of how colonialism works, because everybody believed that if it was for Christianity, they could take whatever they found from the heathens and savages. Here we go, we have people's cultures, myths, sacred kind of beliefs, histories, folkloric practices, always pushed aside by power, by wealth, by nobility, by churches, by belief systems. And colonialism tries to convince people that they're not human until they adapt to the righteous supremacy of the colonial force. Then perhaps they'll become human. So this is such a perverted and damaging force, yet it seems so human, and it's so ancient, and you can just step back and see this kind of power over kind of pushing away old systems for the new, for wrong, always, usually, over and over again. And I just needed to somehow figured this out. It was paper cutout. There was all these figures. They were all being pushed by the powers of kind of these forces into a conch shell, kind of never to return again, ideally by the enforcers. But of course, the conch shell has great life. You can always hear the ocean when you lift it up to your ear. It's resonant and it remains there. It's waiting to come back. I just had to put this in here because it's so incredibly important. While I was in London at the British Museum, they had an exhibition of John White's watercolors from one of the first sea voyages to what is now Canada and the Arctic, trying to find the Northwest Passage. John White was an English artist. He made this watercolor called The Skirmish at Bloody Point, and I saw this and it really changed my life. It changed my world. In 1577, Sir Martin Frobisher encountered Inuit for the first time. He was a British seaman. He went there looking for gold, looking for the Northwest Passage. What struck me was that these men who came from a place of steel and guns and kind of refined warfare went to one of the most remote and pristinely beautiful places in the world with an extraordinary culture. And their first meeting with these people was gunfire. They took out their guns, they killed Inuit at a local settlement. The Inuit tried to fight back. This is recorded in detail from the diaries of the men on the boats, the British men on the boats. They killed 5 or 6 Inuit people. They captured 3 people, brought them back to England as human specimens for museums. They did not live, those people, of course. They were killed by germs. They still have the amouti of one of the women in the British Museum with her shape of her body is still present in that. I think of the Inuit people and the terror that they would have felt at seeing that vision. What were these things? These people in these colored clothing with these exploding objects that killed people. That's the history of Canada. This is the very first attempt to plant an English colony in Canada by England in the New World. So this here is the story of our country, and there's many stories of our country. There's millions of stories of our country, but this one isn't known. No one talks about it. It's so key. It says so much. And what is unbelievable is that today, 444 years later, Mary Simon, an Inuit leader from Nunavik, has been appointed the first Indigenous Governor General by the British Canadian Crown. That's contradictory, that's complicated. This is just 6 weeks after Nunavut NDP MP Mumalek Kakobek quit politics and gave her a farewell speech saying that Canada is a country stained with blood that was created off the backs, trauma, and displacement of Indigenous peoples. So this is the kind of, if we hold all of this at once, how can we hold it all at once? It's all true, it's all our history, and how can we carry it as white people that have just borne by the fate of our skin to hold this like the sins of our fathers in this way. I made this image that at the same time as I made the clearances, it's a part of the installation, it's paper cutouts, and it was just my attempt to process this idea of these men that jumped to their deaths, 2 men jumped to their deaths to try to evade capture by those British people in their boats. And I work with overhead projectors, and those projectors to me are always trying to animate a kind of psychic narrative that happens. So in this particular way, the projector goes on and off and makes the projection on the cliffside scene in the Arctic go from day to night to day to night, kind of indefinitely. And I wanted to try to talk about how what happened almost 500 years ago is still playing out today. In 2010, I made this work when the bow breaks. I had a kind of feeling of the end of the empire, the European, the kind of white hold on supremacy is disintegrating. This little white baby in the mourning outfit represented that on the very edge of falling out of their cradle. I've also tried to collaborate as a way to move into equitable relationships as a settler with Indigenous artists, and also as an artist with people I greatly admire. This is a way to have conversation without the English language. In this particular piece, it's called Greek Tragedy, and John Kurak made the mask. I made the kind of faceless, like empty Greek figure that's holding it, kind of reckoning and looking back at each other. This is John Kurak's work, Heaven on Geese. He's an extraordinary sculptor from Kanga Clinic. Finally, this is just kind of the only context of my work that I'm going to go right into the ideas behind White Elephant specifically. Right after this is just a piece I made in 2016 called White Privilege. So it's a very long white porcelain chain with a small child's hand just kind of clinging on above. It's very fragile, very about to break at any moment. So when I was thinking about all of this stuff and thinking about what to propose to Kafka, I came up with the idea of a piece called White Elephant. White Elephant is a possession which its owner cannot dispose of, and whose cost, particularly that of maintenance, is out of proportion to its usefulness, which is about how I feel about whiteness about now. I thought a lot about the outsized, kind of extreme, exaggerated value and importance and kind of focus on whiteness that happens in a majority white culture that's colonially dominated and has so much of the history kind of erased from memory of our government and our kind of school systems. I thought about the almost dysmorphia of being white, how, you know, our self-consciousness, the white version of our self-consciousness, and kind of the doubling of knowing, especially now if you're involved with these conversations of carrying your skin, like Desmond Cole's book, The Skin We're In, but the white skin that you're in is also a package that you can't escape from. Then about the kind of heteronormative family kind of patriarchal structure that colonial systems brought to Canada, which is very different from so many of the Indigenous realities that they encountered here that still exist. So many different cultures have such a different way of being in family, in community, in gender, with children, and how that relationship has translated into a lot of silencing, a lot of dangerous and violent situations, and a lot of sadness, a lot of loneliness. And as a white person, I feel like I really experienced a lot of that loneliness and disconnection from culture and people and love and warmth and acceptance that sometimes comes with a certain type of white culture. You know, I wanted something about this piece. I thought, how could I make a gesture? I mean, what an impossible task to make an artwork that somewhat represented a moment where I feel like I wanted to express about being white right now in Canada, and the dialogue around whiteness. And I thought right away about The Exorcist, which was a horror film that really gave me nightmares for years as a child in the 70s, and Linda Blair and the kind of Christian terror of having to exorcise this devil that's taken over you and your head spinning. But I also thought the gesture of the head spin is a really, really interesting and important gesture I'll get back to soon. So this idea of kind of terror, excuse me, can be seen in some amazing ways in arts, in film. And again, 2017, Jordan Peele made the extraordinary and completely kind of genre-bending Get Out film, where he really equated racism with terrorism, with terror. And that was so revealing and illuminating for me, how a horror movie could be the perfect vehicle to describe the terror of feeling, well, all the feelings that you might feel if you were at risk of violence every day for the color of your skin, your culture, or your religion. The Merrill Thieves was also an excellent example of a kind of dystopic, horrifying novel that also tried to express, in my interpretation, some of the terrors of residential school. And then I thought about Mr. Rogers, who was really like a childhood character that I watched a little bit of, but didn't really connect too much. It was kind of an American thing, so I didn't see that very much. But anything I've known, I was like, it seems so gentle and dear, and kind of really, I do seem to respect any of the things I've read about him that seem to care about the kind of self-respect of children. But I also think it's super strange that he looks exactly like Norman Bates in Psycho. So I feel like that kind of like two sides of the coin that whiteness is, the kind of, you know, we're good white Canadians and we're capable of genocidal residential schools and kind of clearing out like so many cultures and displacing them with our own, and on and on and on. We don't have to know the list. You know the list. There's other people speak about it better than I. I also, though, wanted to incorporate some compassion and some kind of wisdom that I need, and we all are looking for guidance. So in the head spinning gesture, it represents so many things to me. There's kind of a confusion and a lostness and a grief and a terror, but there's also this Baubo, which is the owl Zeus sent to guide Perseus in the 1981 movie Clash of the Titans, which was also quite influential to me. And this owl has been used as a symbol of knowledge and wisdom and perspicacity and erudition through the Western world. So this is kind of a symbol of education and self-education, and how that might enlighten us to truths that are uncomfortable, but can help us move forward. Here's one of my first sketches of White Elephant. I knew it was going to be 8 or 9 feet tall. It had to be extended and distorted. It had to have a very particular outfit that was referencing a certain type of prim and uptight kind of whiteness. I wanted it to be gender ambiguous because this is really not, there's specificities of gender in terms of whiteness, but this issue is not, it's only one gender. I wanted to be all, and the head had to spin. I made some prototypes, and I started to assemble a team. And one of the most important people that I've been working with over 2 years is Colin Harry, who's a mechatronic designer. He has worked with many artists, helping build kind of animatronics, do electronic programming, make things move, do motors, do all sorts of amazing, ingenious solutions to envisioning kind of movement in sculptures. And we also had incredible conversations throughout the process where I felt so blessed and lucky to have someone who had such an interesting mind and who loved to talk as much as I do, but from a perspective of a Black man as a white woman artist, and us exchanging ideas and listening to each other was a great gift. Alexa McKenzie, wonderful and amazing sculptor and prop builder from the theater world, who was amazing just to get in there and like sculpting at this scale with styrofoam and some of the adhesives and stuff that you have to put into the basis is difficult and messy work. And I'm someone that loves to work with my hands, but it was a lot easier having two people. Heather Goodchild, who's an extraordinary multimedia artist that kind of everything she touches, she can master in terms of materials, is an extraordinary pattern builder and sewer. So I asked her to help me pattern and create the pants. And Julianne Wilding, who's a costume designer, mostly in film these days, but also has done a lot of theater work. And she came in to help assemble the extraordinary wool yardage that I had made by a small machine, and then, rolled up basically and given to me to design and ask Julianne to build. The first part that I had to do was start the sculpting. So here's a plasticine sculpt of the face, which I was interested, it takes a lot to really try to channel a particular expression that I wanted to nail, which was a kind of containment where there's a ton going on, but it's behind the mask. These are the porcelain slip cast pieces that Alex Beaujolais cast in plaster, and then I painted and we fired. They're hollow for the mechanics to go inside. I made the hands out of porcelain, but I just hand built them out of slabs, so they're quite large. They get connected onto the armature. Here's one of Colin's quick drafts for how we're going to soundproof the motor that was going to be living inside the chest of the armature in order to make the head spin but be silent. And here's the design that Colin came up with for the armature that would be something that we could disconnect and connect at all the joint parts so that it could disassemble and assemble for touring. Lightweight, really great design coming out of an industrial process. So here's Colin in the studio last summer when we were really building this thing. And here's kind of like the skeleton of White Elephant with their shoes and their head on. Next step, styrofoam. Next step, Sawzall, which was days of carving it down, which I was just by myself for to get that body. And then a kind of foam coating to make it resilient and tough. Here's Alexa working on the feet with getting the kind of socks on the under thing done, and Colin on the back working with the electrical programming. Here's some of my references, thinking about the kind of clothing that was influential to me as a child and what I saw through the eyes of a white girl in terms of white beauty in the 80s. And I was like, I knew that these were the pants that they had to wear. And here's Heather again with her muslin, trying to create the perfect pattern on top of what is kind of a body, but also just a shape. I had tons of white weave bundles that I had bought off the internet, and painstakingly, with the help of Alexa, embedded them into the head of the sculpture in order to create a really thick head of white hair, which then had to be cut because I knew I had a very specific cut in mind. And so I invited Dallas Wagner to come in, and it took her 4 hours at Broker Scissors. She was amazing. As you can see, kind of a page boy. And then this sweater, the design, again, kind of 1940s, 1980s, thinking about something like this, but inspired by something like this, which was a film in 2013 that I saw, but you might recognize these sweaters. It's kind of a Scottish, British, wool is a cold weather, wet, cold weather place where they have sheep. Inside Llewellyn Davis by the Coen brothers had these kind of coffee house folk singers were just seemed to be the epitome of whiteness to me, and they always stuck in my mind. They actually were based on the Clancy brothers, who were a true and influential Irish folk group in the 60s. So here you go, they're there with those sweaters. And here's Julianne taking the yardage and starting to cut and serge, which was an extraordinarily difficult and courageous job materially for her to do because the wool was very precious. And it was amazing for her just to boldly go in. Not very many people that had knitting skills wanted to take this part of this job on. Here she is working with these crazy long arms. And here's the sculpture back in my studio. I had to borrow a different one to sculpt it because my place was just too small to do that, but I moved it in and I assembled it. And here we are, here's Heather with the pants. So the process, as I said, was 2 years, and I was able to first put it together and assemble it completely at the Gardner Museum. Claudine mentioned that this sculpture will be touring as part of Outside the Palace of Me, which is another exhibition of my work that the Gardner Museum has commissioned. It'll be going across Canada. So we had the opportunity, it was supposed to open this kind of winter, spring, and then because of COVID, we had to postpone a whole year, but we actually got to mount the show, light it, photograph it before it was all taken down and put into crates. So that's the wildness of our times. But here's Julianne and Heather working on their beautiful kind of detailing, hand sewing of the trousers and the sweater, and Colin kind of just finessing the motor. And here we have the final piece at the Cambridge Idea Exchange Library, currently up right now. And I had a really fantastic team of installers and everybody at the Cambridge Library, where there's also right across the hallway is like a selection of books that are out for people to kind of take out, look at, browse, and get at their own local branches. So this whole project is really kind of fully programmed and has a ton of reading and research for people to kind of dip into at whatever place they're at in considering what whiteness is to them, what whiteness is to other people. And here, John Jones is a photographer who took these quite beautiful photographs of the final piece, where we can just take a look at this strange object. And here I am, for context of scale, I have to put a broomstick attached to a brush to brush its hair, because at the end of the day, it gets quite wild with all the head spinning. Part of this project was wanting to share some of the research and the things that were on my mind, because so much of it I'm thinking about all the time, and I wanted a place for that. So there is an Instagram that if you are interested in that and medium, you can follow it at White Elephant 2021. And I've posted all sorts of articles that are available online for people that might be resistant to some of the really hard data and the realities of this experience. White people that are struggling with believing that it could possibly be true, that this is such a real and dangerous issue that whiteness has kind of become for so many people. As we know, we don't, like, there's just so many examples that we could go into right now, very recent and very current, very huge and small examples that we could give that are up to all of us to listen to and consider and reflect on and figure out ways to stop, disentangle, and protect. Unfortunately, we had our eyes so on the States the last couple of years with Trump in office that it was very frustrating to me to see how often people would just kind of consider their issues when right here in Canada, we are dealing with this stuff as rapidly, but way more quietly. And because we're not on the international stage in the same way, people aren't talking about our issues as much. So we don't see it as much in the media. Our media also colludes with this by kind of whitewashing it and softening it. I just had to put this in because I was just the #1 Trump supporter of this last election that gave $2.1 billion to make sure Mr. Trump got back into office. These people are right out there existing with us. And we are all aware of that famous image. And I didn't even want to share ones closer to home. There are too many that are too painful right now. They take place mostly, a lot of this fomenting, kind of the most brutal part of it, as we all know, is happening online in dark corners of the web, and then being manifested throughout systems of the military and police and kind of just groups of, defensive, angry, fearful white people. So this is a meme, which is a meme is a huge culture in kind of white supremacy online. And this is one that's kind of an incel, MAGA, school shooter type meme. That's kind of, people are welcome to contribute to these images and share them as kind of a private, in-joke, weird way to communicate about all sorts of subjects, the kind of white supremacy system, symbol there, that are so dark and so, strangely not taken. Like when I look at a meme like this, I'm like, where the people that are making this and having the dialogue, often young men, there seems to be no seriousness in their minds or hearts about what that implies or represents. Through the process of this project, I've also been looking to other mediums to try to express some of the ideas or thoughts or feelings about how can I use art? Can we use art to express some of these things? This is called Lone Shooter. It's thinking about how much gun violence there is in terms of the individual lone shooter that we are all way too familiar with, and is always a white male. That is never really identified in terms of data and really spoken about in those particular intersections of the threat and the very real problem of terror. Also on my Instagram, I have different kind of helpful places for people, white people, anybody, to consider how to manage shame and guilt and worry. So especially so that you can start healing yourself and find new ways to move forward in the next part of the journey of kind of opening your mind and moving like through into hopefully better places collectively, but also for just to stop putting defensiveness or that kind of thing on people of color, BIPOC people that don't need that. There's also some really wonderful book recommendations. Anne Bishop is a really amazing anti-racist activist that's been working out of Nova Scotia for decades. And this book I really recommend, Becoming an Ally. Really great podcasts out there talking about whiteness. This is a fantastic book, Nell Irvin Painter, The History of White People, really extraordinary to kind of learn about some of the kind of foundational myths and where they came from and some of the foundational systems and what we're dealing with and how I always find when I get to the root causes of things, it helps me so much understand and kind of start to get my imagination going of how to dismantle them. This also, Seen on Radio, is a podcast. It's a radio kind of documentary program that has a kind of I think it's a 10-part series called Seeing White, Turning the Lens. It's extraordinary. It's really excellent listening. I highly recommend it. Those of us that grew up again in the 70s and 80s might recognize Little House on the Prairie. I did a drawing this year, kind of inspired by Little House, but also thinking in the Canadian context about the kind of settler mythology and also the white woman. This is called Settler, and the kind of compromises that, and the kind of subjugation, but also the compromises that white women made in order to be protected and under the kind of wagon of whiteness that has been so disastrous, but also for women themselves. These are the kind of the bed we made, and how can we unmake that bed? This is the 1881 census here. This is my own personal context and kind of introduction of my history in Canada. My father's family came from Ireland. You can see with the yellow underline, as a farm laborer. My great-great-grandfather, John Boyle, and his wife and young son. They landed in Ontario right around the time of the Great Famine in Ireland. You could see that free grants of farmland was being given by Canada, and bonuses. It's the nearest British colony. You can get settlers on this land. You can get this free land and some cash bonuses. To think about, especially an impoverished farm laborer from any of England, Scotland, Ireland, Germany, like any of the kind of places in Europe. There's so many of folks from Russia, whatever, that ended up on the prairies, that took these opportunities, that never considered once, were never told and considered that was somebody else's land, that they were going to settle right on top of someone else's land. You can't even imagine that happening today to any one of us, someone coming to your front door and being like, okay, you're out, we're going to be taking over your home and taking your children away. But also these people, just like today, very many people immigrate to Canada, not thinking about that, just looking for a better life for their family and their children. And we can all relate to that. We're not realizing the systems that we're perpetuating and establishing, especially these old white settler families, like my own colonial kind of history, was a part of that process. Canada, the new homeland. There's a romance and a narrative to the kind of white cowboy and these Scottish curlers. So I'm starting to look at like a Canadian identity that's plugged into whiteness, that's a part of our heritage and history, that there's been kind of, some kind of innocence and celebratory nature of that. But there's these kind of dark sides that we don't know how to cope with. And because we haven't had a part of our education systems, and we're not looking at it as white people in our arts and culture that much, we have been under-informed and brutally ignorant, and belatedly coming to the table to now reckon with things that most of us are just gutted by, in terms, of residential schools, and people just coming to the table now of things that have been out and known for 50 years, 60 years. There's a brutality to the culture, and a meanness of spirit that comes with aggression and kind of hierarchies of power. But there's also people just trying to get by. And this is my mom and dad in the back with the pink arrows, and my little brother up at the front, coming from working class people without any money, really young, having children, figuring out how to survive in Canada, just as laborers, but participating in systems, everybody that would have given them privilege to terms of many of these jobs, over top of people that somehow weren't as Canadian as they were. My mom's family is coming from not a royal by any means, probably one of their, chambermaids at some point way back when, coming over to Canada, as well as my great-great-grandfather was, what do you call him, blanking on the word, an ironsmith, and my grandfather was a baker. So they're all, white homesteaders, basically. I grew up in Scarborough, which is here on the left. It's the original plan of the Toronto Purchase Treaty, and this Purchase Treaty, which was originally made in 1787 to 1800, it covers the cities of Etobicoke, Toronto, North York, York, and Vaughan. That is located within the boundaries, massive, massive amount of land. These are the Scarborough Bluffs, where I grew up quite close to. The Purchase Treaty was originally cheated from the Mississaugas of the New Credit by the British for 1,700 pounds worth of kettles, blankets, and gunpowder, which the chiefs believed were a gift for their loyalty against in certain kind of fighting for on the behalf of the British. They didn't realize that the British were like, oh no, you just sold your land. In 1998, the Mississaugas of the Credit filed a claim against the government of Canada to address these lies and the supposed purchase that they never agreed to of this land. And over the course of 12 years, there was a long-standing, court battle. The government of Canada finally settled the Toronto Purchase claim and the Brant Tract claim for a compensation to the Mississaugas of the Credit for $145 million. Think of all that land. Think of that massive chunk of land that I just described there. At the time, it was the largest land claim settlement in Canadian history. I very easily, you can just Google something and find in 2007, the Globe and Mail reported that in London, England alone, the government of Canada owns 75 luxury homes that are used by their civil servants with an estimated value of more than 150 million. So do the math, these crazy contradictions and these unquestionable, like the kind of systems of the government that have been exploited and kind of greed. It's really hard to know how to wrap your mind around, how to hold it, and how when, systems of democracy that we felt that we could vote for and we could protest against are so slow to shift, are so resistant to change when you have this stuff this information right here at your fingertips. As for me, growing up in Scarborough, I was just a white kid in the 70s where there was a lot of this kind of culture. This is, actually a picture taken in Norway, but it looks exactly like Scarborough in the 70s. The kind of white kids that could have been in my neighborhood. And we think, what is Canadian culture? White, kind of average middle class, not the upper echelons, which I don't have that much personal things to say about, as I wasn't part of that class. But really, Tim Hortons is owned by Restaurant Brands International, which is a majority owned by Brazilian investment firm, 3G Capital. Anne-Marie, or what else do we got here? Great Big Sea. This is not, these are very serious things I'm talking about too, but we have to take a look. It's hard to consider where our culture is lying if we left it back in our origin countries. What has Canada provided? What have we created? What have we brought? Hockey. I don't feel reflected by hockey. I have no connection to that game. Mounties. RCMP's role as a colonial paramilitary force. Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, created the RCMP in 1873 to extend Canada's colonial control over Indigenous territories in what would become Western Canada. Police and the Mounties are essentially private property security guards with the rights to use weapons and violence in order to protect that property. That is their basic job. So we have a lot of things to look at the mirror about, and how can we do this in the art world in particular, and use art? Can art be a tool in social justice? I believe it can. We know music can. We know visual art can communicate. And as an artist, it's all I can do is try to consider these ideas through arts. And through making art. And so I hope that my project White Elephant and all the amazing extensions that Kafka has deepened and widened it, and the conversations that hopefully will take place because of people going in and stumbling in on it and thinking about it maybe and asking questions. Hopefully it'll just be one little tiny drop in the bucket of a gigantic conversation and a movement in order to make some kind of future that we're going to feel proud and excited by. It's like what keeps me going. I do believe that if you're making art, you have hope. If you stop making art, you've given up. So I'll be continuing to make art. please look into Kafka's summer reading series. There's still many excellent programs to take part in, and you can, if you go on their website, and look at their programming, please engage. It's been wonderful so far, and something that is an excellent thing to sign off on is Lila Said's Me and White Supremacy workbook, which hopefully it's an online 4-evening kind of group discussion based on the workbook that she has written for this really excellent book, and that people can participate and do kind of small actions to enlarge their thinking and ways of moving forward together. So this is an amazing opportunity. Thank you, Kafka, for presenting. Thank you for hosting me. And I hope that by some of us like just taking the risk to talk about really uncomfortable, difficult things, it will become easier and the conversation will become deeper, wider, and actually make things happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Shary, for all of that. Just give me a second here. I'm just going to look to see if we've any questions come in. There were a couple while you were speaking. One person said The Square is so must see. It's a very interesting movie for sure. I saw it shortly after it first came out. Another person, in reference to the pattern, they said, oh my God, I had that pattern.
No kidding, really?
Another person says, thank you for your careful thought, sensitivity, eloquence, and of course your work. Another thank you from a fellow biennial artist in the comments there.
Congrats. I wonder, I mean, it's really sad that we're doing this by Zoom. I really appreciate that we have the opportunity to do it by Zoom, but I also feel like these conversations really need to be had in person, looking in each other's eyes and being in the same room with each other so that we can experience the discomfort, but also kind of engage and learn about each other's responses and the reality of those feelings together. Like, I think that that's going to do so much to help make this conversation more front and center if we can do it in person. So I really look forward to that. And I appreciate that it's also very hard to ask questions, but if anybody has a comment or disagreement or kind of something that they felt they didn't, weren't happy with, I would also, be welcome that as well.
Can you put the Instagram account back on the screen again, just so people can copy it down?
Yes. Oh God. Can I? That's the question. I don't know.
Or Caitlin, can you just type it in the comments maybe, or someone just type it in the comments?
Yeah, because I'm going to touch something and then we're in trouble. Oh, here, hold on. Maybe I've done it. Can you still see my screen and I'm going through the thing?
Yeah, you're in. Yep.
Okay. There we go.
There we go. Just in the bottom right corner there. We have a question. So thank you so much for sharing with us. Getting to see some of the in-process photographs was fantastic and really enlightening. I'd love to hear a little bit more about how you came to the facial expression of containment. What was that process like?
I made many versions, as you can imagine. It's a lot of trying to be by myself in the studio and channel an intuitive feeling. I mean, all of the drawings I made too about the lone gunman and the settler and stuff, there's a lot of, in art in general, there's a lot of silent intuiting. If you've, been doing it your whole life and you've got an inner sense that's a kind of frequency, you dial in the radio, and I knew what I was trying to express, which was, like a combination of many contradictory things in a single expression without over emphasizing any one of them, because this, as a subject and an expression, there's so many ways you can oversimplify this subject. So I'm not sure if I can really perfectly articulate that process, but when I got it, I knew I had it. And I was so thankful that I had it, because I knew it was actually going to be really, really hard. At least for me, I had it. What I wanted to express was there. And for me, that was a kind of humanity, because regardless of our crimes, and anybody in like a prison restoration situation will tell you this, regardless of a person's crimes, they are more than the worst things that they've ever done or the worst things that their people have ever done. So they're white people are people, and we're just like everybody else. So I wanted to have a sense of like humanity and kind of compassion, but I also wanted to have the silence and the repression that comes with keeping secrets, which I think is also, at least in kind of a British cultural situation, is very rampant in that family situation, and the kind of larger sense of like the stiff upper lip. You keep it quiet, you don't complain, you don't talk about it. And in that you bury the past and you will not take responsibility for the past. And so, as anybody knows that's been a victim of abuse, perhaps, if your abuser is not going to acknowledge that that happened, the gaslighting that goes on can be incredibly damaging. So I wanted there to be kind of all of those things within one face, which is why the head spinning is not only about the kind of horror and terror of it, but it's also about the confusion of being white and not knowing how to change systems.
Thank you. Comment, I caught the Halifax Library discussion and appreciate the continuing conversation on racism issues.
Cool.
Give me 1 second here. Can you talk about the decisions for the seated position of White Elephant?
Well, I definitely wanted some, like the kind of position of the body is very like a Sears catalog model. So there's a real kind of mannerism involved that's very perfect and controlled and rigid, and not giving anything away and putting the best face forward. And I think that in all sorts of systems of power, regardless of race and culture, is something that can be used to bury the past, again. So there's a kind of repression involved, but there's also a performance, because like all race too, we are so many things. We're all individuals, and we are ending up being narrowly contained in a kind of performance of the person that maybe our social cultural situation has told us we are. So we're always fighting with that, like how the difference between your inner self and your outer self. That pose was very much about a kind of controlled containment and a hiding almost of your real self. But there's also pragmatic things to think about when you're a sculptor, and that is like engineering. And so I knew I wanted to make a really grotesquely distended, gigantic, overbearing kind of sculpture, and that wasn't going to stand. You're not doing a 20-foot long, tall standing sculpture. You need kind of a triangle that has support at the base. And so the seated position with the limbs out and stuff really created a stable posture.
Okay, a couple more thank yous. I have somebody asking how they can get in touch with you. I'm not sure if your information is, can they reach you through your website? Or
the website has a comment section, and the website needs updating, but the comments you can connect through there.
Okay, can you just share your website address for those who don't know?
Yeah, it's www.sharyboyle.com.
Right. Okay, so thank you for showing pictures and describing the process of making the sculpture. I saw White Elephant in person, yet the backstory adds so much to my understanding. I look forward to seeing Outside the Palace of Me with friends and having long and difficult discussions.
Awesome. CAFKA has put together a really great brochure at the Cambridge Library. If anybody gets there, it's up for 2 weeks, and it has a lot of really good writing in it that we all kind of did collectively together to talk about that piece. And it's a great handaway because it's got the reading book list and it's got all sorts of other information in it. So maybe there's a way, also just look at the CAFKA website, because there's a lot of this writing is up there, and maybe we'll end up putting a bit more up there at some point. We'll see.
Another question, how do you see this project moving forward?
Yeah, great question. I mean, it's going to tour, so it'll be part of a larger context of artworks around kind of identity and like what I was just talking about, performance of the outer identity versus who you are on the inside. That's a big show that's outside the Palace of Me. So 3 years, it'll be touring around different places. And I imagine over the course of those 3 years, the conversation will be shifting all the time. Because of COVID, our time was very short to show it with Kafka. That, 2 weeks is pretty limited run. There was some talk about maybe, wouldn't it be interesting at the end, because the final stop on the tour where this work will end up again in Kitchener-Waterloo at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery in 2023. So that's 2 years, 3 years down the road. What will the conversation be like then? Wouldn't it be interesting to kind of have maybe another public discussion at that point and kind of connect those things from when I first proposed this, sculpture in 2017, the conversation was different. At that point, the idea of white elephant, like the white elephant in the room that no one's speaking about, people are speaking about it now. Things are shifting a little bit in terms of the conversation, I think. So I would just love to see systems shift, but that's something that maybe the more of us talk about, the more aware regular people will become. So it's up to us to see how it's going to change.
I guess we have a question here. I think this is just building off some of the things you spoke about, news stories. Someone's asking if you have thoughts on the Amy Cooper situation, who called the police on the birder in Central Park, as she's a Canadian.
Oh, yeah. Well, in that way, I would just reflect on the man who had to cope with that situation and his responses and his feelings about it. He would be the one to speak to that. I think that he did exactly right by just videotaping an unbelievable situation, an unconscionable, however you say that word, action by that person. The gender thing in whiteness is really complicated and really painful, obviously, for everybody involved. And what came out of that was the notion of Karens. I think that was one of the first one of the big kind of moments of the Karen phenomenon that kind of went wild online, that had a lot of misogyny kind of built into it. But then white women too have had this vicious history around anti-Blackness and their involvement in the kind of systems with white men. And so having to come and confront the gender intersection in whiteness is really difficult. And how patriarchy and misogyny also intersects with all of that. Very, very complicated. So all I can say, how can I talk about that? I certainly don't identify with that person. I identify if it's with just the man whose name I can't remember. I couldn't even remember her name when you first said Amy Cooper. I couldn't even remember who that was, but the man was what she did was really wrong and really effed up, because what that could have turned into was just insane. It was basically she had a gun in her hand, and he was so gracious because she ended up getting doxxed, and I think, and tons of stuff happened online to I think she got fired from her job. I'm openly imagine, her life got really turned upside down, by the internet, etc. And maybe that has allowed her to reflect, but what he said was that he didn't want to have those things happen to her. He didn't want her to be fired and all those, he was a person with conscience. He was just trying to show what a day going out in the park could be like if you're a Black man. So, that stuff plays out, and there's a lot to think about on both sides.
This is an interesting question. Hi, Shary. Thanks so much for your thoughtful research and discourse. I love the piece. A quick question regarding the hairstyle of your character. When the head is in motion, I'm reminded of the Olympic figure skater Dorothy Hamill and the shampoo commercial which immortalized her wedge haircut. Is there any connection? Do you notice that the 70s and 80s were also a bastion of whiteness?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's like, I was born in 72. So a lot of that cultural imagery is really embedded, the television, the kind of magazine advertisements of the time that I can, even as that question came up, I was like, oh, that was Pert shampoo, that and Dorothy Hamill. I was kind of thinking a little bit more along the lines of Little Lord Fauntleroy. It was like a really kind of fey, like European British kind of nobility character from the court imagery of, with like a little page boy haircut, and the primness of that kind of like repressed and androgynous haircut, really. Remember the haircut that the actor had in No Country for Old Men? What's that, a gorgeous, amazing
Oh,
actor?
Javier Bardem, yeah.
Remember that haircut? That was very much like that haircut, which was one of the scariest things about his character in the movie, was to see that haircut on him. Like, immediately struck horror in my heart when I first saw that film. So yeah, I mean, there's something about Dorothy Hamill, but the spinning, like, you know, that was also why the weave had to go on so thick, because I knew when it spun, I didn't want any of the gaps to show. So why the scissors got broken. Yeah, androgyny, repression.
We have a question about if the recording. So yeah, the talk is being recorded. It may be shared later online. So just keep in touch with us on our social channels and our website for updates about that. We have a comment. I love the Mr. Rogers Anthony Perkins comparison. Just give me a second, making sure I'm not missing anyone's comment or question. Okay, so right now we're caught up with all the question and comments. Is there anything else that anybody wanted to add or ask of Shary before we wrap this up then, if there's anything that we haven't covered yet?
Well, I think that I would just like to thank everybody for tuning in tonight and participating and sticking with it, and encourage everybody to hopefully, you know, take some steps amongst people in your own life that have a hard time talking about this, and kind of maybe gently pointing over to this sculpture and using it like a stepping stone for some conversations, so that each time it's a little bit easier and we can do the work of keeping people safe and equal.
Oh, we do have one more question. Thank you for being so brave. Do you feel intimidated to do this work? Is speaking about this making yourself vulnerable in a way that is scary, and how?
Oh, that's a really good question. And yes, of course, like, for sure. It's totally vulnerable. And also, it also is really like, you know, I have no confidence that I have a right to take up this space in this discussion. I do believe that it is really crucial for white people to speak, and that for also white people to speak to other white people is really crucial part, I think, of how this is going to shift and change and become better. But for me to take those steps, I've always had a little bit of in all of my work, I've gone towards like the uncomfortable, the thing that people don't like to speak about. It is a bit of the tendency in my artwork. You can look into all sorts of parts of my artwork and see like, oh yeah, it is about things that are a little bit push-pull, you know. So I have, you know, the history of doing that and the desire to do that. But yeah, it is really vulnerable. And I know there's no way to speak. There's no one way to speak about this. There's no right way to speak about it. And I'm sure there's so many ways that you can do it wrong. You could hurt somebody. You could be, you know, ignorant, obtuse. There's so many things you could miss. But I also feel like if your heart is open and you're willing to make mistakes and you keep calm and you don't freak out, then it's going to be okay. And we can all do it.
Thank you. So yeah, so we'll wrap it up here then. So thank you everybody for your questions and for your time and for bearing with us through the technical glitches at the beginning of the talk. Thanks again to Marcy Bronson and the team at Cambridge Galleries and Idea Exchange for being our partner on this. You have until August 7th, which is next Saturday, to see the work in person. And as Shary mentioned, please do check out the resources that are available across the hall at the Cambridge Library. If you're not local to Cambridge, most libraries do have an option where you can order books for the collection. So you can carry that on. There is a reading list that's linked on our website as well. Shary did a lot of extensive research putting together a reading list for that. And yes, if you'd like to see what else we have going on for the rest of the biennial, we have about 5 weeks left. Our website is CAFKA.21.CAFKA.org. And thank you so much for joining us, everybody, this evening. Have a great night.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudine.
Bye, Shary.
Bye. Take care.